My wife screamed like the house was burning down. Her voice pierced the morning silence sharp as broken glass, echoing from the upstairs bathroom. I dropped my coffee, bolted up the stairs, heart pounding. Not because I thought she was hurt, but because there was something in her tone that was worse than pain. It was disbelief. She stood in the middle of the shower stall, soap clinging to her face, suds dripping from her hair like melting snow. Water had stopped. Not slowed, not trickled, just stopped like curtain falling mid-act. The faucet spat nothing but silence, no water. Not in the shower, not in the sink, not even in the garden hose. I tried them all, each one more futile than the last. My first thought was plumbing, maybe burst pipe underground, maybe the main had blown. But then I saw it, the orange notice, staked arrogantly into the damp soil right above cleanly severed water line. It fluttered in the breeze like flag of war. Unauthorized water access terminated, HOA directive. Just like that, clinical, cold, final. That was the moment I realized something far bigger just happened. Something beyond simple HOA overreach. They had no idea what they'd touched. They thought they were enforcing community standards, maintaining suburban order. But they'd severed line they didn't even know they depended on, thapos. E-drawn blood from vein that fed them. And the irony, the lake their pipes drank from, the very reservoir fueling their precious lawns, their pristine toilets, their Sunday morning coffee, was mine, legally, every drop. I crouched next to the cut pipe, touching the edge where it had been sheared. It wasn't sloppy. It was surgical, precise. This wasn't mistake. This was decision, declaration. And it carried the smug scent of one person, Karen Wilbur, our self-appointed HOA president, self-proclaimed guardian of aesthetics and standards, a woman whose idea of leadership involved finding residents for mismatched curtains and rogue garden gnomes. You see, Karen had been escalating. It started with passive-aggressive notes and devolved into actual citations. One for Birdhouse to Bohemian, another for Child's chalk drawing that disrupted commute. Uniformity. She was drunk on bylaws, high on laminated charters, and had recently begun campaign against what she dubbed unauthorized utilities. Apparently our waterline made her list wide, because the satellite image showed a pipe branching from the rear of my property into the HOA distribution hub. She didn't ask, she didn't investigate, she acted, like queen with dull sword but an overactive decree. So I walked straight to her office, which, let's be honest, was just desk wedged inside her oversized garage, flanked by potpourri info certificates of authority. I didn't knock. She looked up with that familiar smirk like she'd just docked points on sixth grade science fair. We've handled the unauthorized tap, she said as if it were an item on her checklist. It's over. I asked her one question. Had she bothered to check the county water rights registry? Her eyes flickered. She smiled again, thinner this time, and said she didn't need to, that all communal land required board approval for utilities. And then she went back to sipping her tea. That was her fatal mistake, that assumption, that blindness wrapped in bureaucratic confidence. I leaned over her desk, combat cold. Karen, I said, you're drinking from Mike. You just cut off the only property with legal ownership of your entire water source. I hope your azaleas enjoy the drought. She laughed, actually laughed, like I was bluffing, like she had backup. I didn't say another word. I walked out, straight-backed, boiling inside. Because while she thought I was lashing out in anger, I wasn't. I was awakening something worse. Precision, patience, proof. Back home, I opened my safe and pulled out the deed. Years ago, I bought a stretch of land behind my property that had been overlooked in local development plans. It was swampy, unkempt, and had a natural lake most considered worthless. But I did my research that a lake sat atop deep aquifer and, more importantly, came with full water rights. I'd kept it quiet for years. Let the HOA route their pipes through it, thinking they were clever, dodging rising municipal rates. I never charged them, never complained. It cost me nothing until now. I called my lawyer. He confirmed what I already knew. The easement predating the HOA's formation gave me sole ownership and supply control. There was even a clause. Any interference or damage to my infrastructure voided all implied access. They hadn't just cut my pipe, they'd cut their own throat. And yet, I didn't rush to retaliate. That's not how you win war like this. No, I needed them to understand what they'd done. I needed the silence to grow loud. And Karen, she played right into it. That same day, she posted victory photo in the neighborhood app, her standing next to my severed pipe, smiling like she'd just conquered small nation. The caption read, "No more freeloaders." The HOA takes theft seriously. The comments were a mix of emojis and misplaced praise. But underneath, confusion, questions. Wait, isn't that the line from the lake? Isn't that how we get our water? I answered with one photo, crystal clear shot of my deed, time-stamped, county sealed, and posted with one line. Funny thing about lakes, when you own them, you decide who gets to drink. It exploded. My phone lit up like Christmas tree. Neighbors called, some angry, some curious, all suddenly aware that the woman wielding power had just jeopardized the entire community's water supply. Still, I gave them a chance. I told them plainly, reconnect the pipe, issue a formal apology, and we move on. Otherwise, the lake goes dark. Karen didn't blink. She doubled down, accused me of blackmail, said I was exploiting natural resources for personal leverage. I sent her my lawyer's number. She declined. That night, as I stood by the lake under a sliver of moonlight, my wife joined me with a glass of wine. What now? She asked. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the water shimmer. Quiet, obedient, waiting. Then I said, I want them to throw a party. The big one. Then we pull the plug. She stared at me. You're going to wait. I nodded. Some lessons have to be lived to be understood. You don't flip switch in the dark. You let them bathe in light, in comfort, in control. Then shut it all down when they're too drunk on their illusion to see what's coming. Karen thought she'd silence me, but I wasn't quiet. I was winding up the dial. What they didn't realize was this. I didn't need to scream. I owned the silence. The next morning, I woke up to a different kind of silence. It wasn't the absence of water this time. It was the kind of silence that follows slow detonation, where the blast is invisible, but the pressure is still rising. I could feel it in the air as I walked to my mailbox. There were no children laughing, no sprinklers ticking, no dogs barking behind watered fences. Just dry grass, curious glances from across the street, and the slow collective inhalation of neighborhood on the brink of realizing it had been drinking from fantasy. Karen hadn't responded publicly to the photo of the deed, not directly, but I noticed the shift almost immediately. Residents began passing slower in front of my house. Some walked their dogs twice just to circle the perimeter, eyes flicking between the lake and the rusting pump junction on my property. An elderly man in bucket hat stopped to ask sotto voce whether the deed was real. I'm not trying to get involved, he muttered, but if this is true, may all be in trouble. I nodded once and said, I didn't start this. I'm just the one who owns the reservoir. Karen, of course, was still playing queen. She posted second announcement in the app titled clarifying the misinformation. It was long-winded screed that began with phrases like community cohesion and unauthorized claims of ownership, peppered with enough passive aggression to fill therapy office. Her conclusion was bold. The HOA will not be coerced into reversing necessary action based on dubious documentation. We stand by our decision, dubious documentation. That one stuck with me. So I paid a visit to the county records office, not to file complaint, but to gather portfolio. The staff were helpful, amused even. When I mentioned my HOA, one woman said, Bo, are you from Maple Ridge? We've had 3 complaints about the same woman in the last month. I left with certified copies of everything. DDs meant original utility permits dating back 2 decades. On the way out, I ran into Mitch. Mitch was civil engineer I'd gone to college with, now working for the county's environmental infrastructure division. We hadn't seen each other in years, but he recognized me immediately. We sat down at a nearby coffee shop, and over 2 cappuccinos and stale blueberry muffin, I laid out the situation. He didn't say much as I talked. Just raised his eyebrows, leaned in, and whistled low when I showed him the aerial surveys. He said finally, they're pumping through zone that hasn't been updated for new code. That alone is violation. He offered to draft formal report complete with survey overlays. I agreed, and he told me I'd have it by the end of the week. While Mitch prepped paperwork, Karen went on the offensive. She posted poll in the app. Should private ownership be allowed to threaten community infrastructure? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The comments did it for me. Woman named Denise replied, if we've been using his lake without permission, aren't we the ones threatening infrastructure of another user? Anonymous added, I've lived here 11 years. Not once did the HOA disclose where our water came from. What else aren't they telling us? The next day, I took a quiet stroll to the pump station. It was a small fenced enclosure shaded by pine trees and half hidden behind a cluster of ornamental rocks. The lock was intact. My control valve remained untouched. I unlocked the panel and opened it just to confirm the timer was still synced. Saturday's event, Maple Ridge's annual summer kickoff, was the biggest gathering of the year. Water slides, dunk tanks, taco trucks, all dependent on my lake. Later that evening, Karen doubled down again. She posted a promotional video for the event, complete with drone footage of the community park and an upbeat ukulele soundtrack. In it, she smiled at the camera and announced, come celebrate unity, fun, and the strength of shared community resources. That last part made me pause the video and laugh. Shared resources. Interesting phrase coming from someone who didn't own any of them. But I still wasn't ready to pull the plug, not yet. I wanted the narrative to ripen, so I made move that even surprised myself. I invited Helena, the quietest, least confrontational member of the board. For coffee, she was known for abstaining from votes and always sitting near the exits during meetings. But I suspected she was more observant than she let on. We met at a small cafe just outside the neighborhood. She arrived nervously, eyes darting like she was worried Karen would appear out of thin air. I laid out the facts calmly, clearly. I showed her the documents. I showed her Mitch's report draft. I showed her the valve. I haven't shut it yet, I said. But if Karen pushes this any further, I will. Helena didn't say much at first, but she did listen. Her hands trembled as she sipped her coffee. Before we parted, she asked one question. If she apologizes and fixes the pipe, will you really just let it go? I told her yes, as it was never about vengeance. It was about truth and boundary and respect. That night, something strange happened. My doorbell rang at 9:30 p.m. It was Todd, Karen's brother-in-law. He stood on my porch wearing a reflective vest and holding a flashlight like he was trying to impersonate a utility worker. Just doing routine inspection, he said, avoiding my eyes. I didn't reply. I simply pointed at the camera mounted above the doorframe and said, smile for the legal record. He left without another word. The next day, the HOA board released an official agenda for Saturday morning's pre-event meeting, the topic, handling misinformation and external threats. No mention of the lake, no mention of the pipe. Just that vague simmering language that bureaucrats use when they're trying to smother fire by pretending it's smoke. I prepared my final step at precisely 1 p.m. on Saturday, the peak of the event when the slides would be slickest and the dunk tank fullest. The remote timer would activate and close the main valve. Not enough to endanger anyone. Emergency flows would continue, but everything else would stop. Bathrooms, balloons, sprinklers, the works. Friday evening, I walked the perimeter of the lake one last time. The wind was warm, soft, like breath held just before scream. I paused by the control box, laid my hand on the steel, and whispered, let them learn. Early Saturday morning, I received text from Mitch. The final report was complete. It included environmental impact violations, illegal pump placement, and unauthorized zoning breaches. I smiled, forwarded it to my lawyer, and then, just for fun, sent copy to the HOA's general email with the subject line, you might want to read this before the dunk tank fills. And then I sat back in my lawn chair, lemonade in hand, watching as cars rolled in, as music played, as Karen paraded across the field like the dictator of a block party. Children laughed. Parents clapped. Someone was grilling hot dogs 2 blocks over. It was perfect, too perfect. At exactly 1 p.m., I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. Then I waited 10 seconds, 20, a full minute, and then the scream started. Not a pain, but confusion. The water jet stopped. The dunk tank sputtered. Slides went dry, sticky and hot. And one by one, parents realized their homes had gone silent too. Karen's face was the last thing I saw before walking back inside. Her mouth moved in frantic bursts. Her hands flailed as she tried to understand what had happened, but I didn't need to hear it. I already knew the silence had spoken for me, and it had spoken loud. I didn't need to be there to see the chaos unfold, but I was, from the comfort of my lawn chair, shaded by the old elm tree that stood like patient witness to neighborhood stupidity, I watched it all happen in real time. I had front row seats to a masterpiece of self-destruction, an HOA orchestrated symphony brought to its knees by the twisted hidden valve and one man's decision not to be ignored. At first, it was just minor confusion. Few parents shouting over the music that the water slide wasn't working. EJ tapping his mic, confused why the cooling fans behind him stopped spinning. Then came the panic, the kind only entitled people feel when something disrupts their carefully choreographed weekend. Karen, of course, was at the center of it all, her beige sun hat flopping uselessly as she moved from station to station trying to problem solve her way out of the disaster she didn't know she'd scheduled with her own arrogance. Kids cried as they slid and stuck awkwardly to the dry vinyl. Teenager tried to refill balloon station and found nothing but coughing faucet. The dunk tank contestant, high school coach with fake mustache, stood on the platform as if suspended in bureaucratic purgatory waiting for a splash that would never come. And then someone made the connection. It wasn't power issue. It wasn't faulty equipment. It was water. No water. None at home, in the park, in the toilets and sinks and hoses. The source had gone silent. I waited for the moment of realization. It came when Karen's assistant, 20-something board member named Natalie, with clipboard bigger than her resume, ran across the field toward Karen, whispering urgently. Karen's face paled. She looked up, her eyes scanning the horizon, and landed on me, still calm, glass of lemonade in hand like suburban executioner. That's when I stood. No theatrics, no swagger, just deliberate steps across the grass as the crowd began to gather like confused spectators at an unfinished performance. I reached the center just as parents started asking questions. Real questions. Why weren't the backup systems working? Was there a break in the main? Had the city been notified? Karen raised her hands, trying to speak over the growing murmur, but her voice cracked. Please, everyone, we're just experiencing brief technical hiccup. Everything will be restored shortly. That lie barely lasted 30 seconds. From the back, a voice shouted, why is there lock on the pump station? Another added, wasn't that line feeding from the lake? And then, as if the universe had sense of humor, someone pulled out their phone and showed my post from 2 days ago. The one with the deed and the caption about choosing who gets the drink. Woman near the taco truck audibly gasped. Child holding half-deflated balloon turned and asked their mom, did he turn off the lake? That's when I spoke. Yes, I said. Loud enough to be heard, calm enough to silence. I did, and not out of vengeance, but responsibility. See, while this community was busy enforcing patio furniture compliance, it forgot to check who owned the water. I pulled out laminated copy of the deed and held it up like reluctant prophet forced to prove his gospel. This lake is mine, has been for years. And when your HOA cut my pipe, they cut off the legal access point for your supply. I warned them, they didn't listen. So I made the choice they forced upon me. No one spoke. Not even Karen, but the weight of silence shifted. It was no longer power. It was revelation. Board member near the edge of the crowd finally cleared his throat. So what happens now? I looked at Karen, who had it moved. That depends, I said. You have 24 hours to issue public apology, restore my line, and acknowledge my ownership. Otherwise, this silence becomes permanent. I turned and walked away as the murmurs resumed, growing into arguments. Someone yelled that the host should be dissolved. Someone else shouted that Karen should resign. A third voice, older and more bitter, said maybe we should have asked questions before we trusted someone with laminated badge and God complex. Back at home, I sat on the porch. I didn't need to watch anymore. The damage was done. The fuse had burned through the last inch. And the explosion wasn't just about water. It was about control, arrogance, and the slow unraveling of false empire. By nightfall, the whole group chat had become battlefield. Some demanded Karen's resignation. Others were in denial, accusing me of extortion and calling for legal action. One person wrote, so what now? We boil lake water like it's the 1800s. Another, more pragmatic, replied, or maybe we just fix the pipe and stop letting tyrants run sandbox. I thought that would be the end of it for the day, but at 10:17 p. and my motion sensor cameras lit up. A lone figure approached the lake's control station, creeping through the shadows like sitcom burglar. He wore hoodie, moved with awkward intent, and carried something metallic. Bolt cutters. I zoomed in. It was Todd again. Karen's idiot brother-in-law, local menace and self-declared community handyman. He fumbled with the lock, glancing over his shoulder like raccoon caught stealing dog food. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Deputy Delgado was on duty. He showed up within 10 minutes. Catching Todd mid-fumble, frozen like deer in someone else's boat. Less mess. Just trying to help, Todd muttered as he sat handcuffed on the folding chair. I brought him cheap plastic seat that somehow felt like poetic justice. Karen showed up 5 minutes later, breathless, trying to act surprised. Todd, what are you doing? He looked at her with mixture of panic and betrayal. You said to make it right before the board meeting. Delgado took both their statements, and though Todd was released with court summons, Karen didn't get off clean. She was issued an official warning. Interference with private infrastructure, bordering on criminal trespass. By morning, the footage had already leaked. I didn't post it, but I didn't need to. The neighborhood group chat was flooded with screenshots, freeze frames of Todd's face mid-trespass, and captions like Watergate 2.0 and Karen's last stand. Even the local news caught wind. Van rolled into the neighborhood by noon, parking in front of the HOA office. Young reporter delivered live segment with the headline, Lake owner locks HOA out. Water rights dispute goes viral. Karen tried to call an emergency closed-door board meeting, but half the members refused to attend unless it was made public, and so it was. That afternoon in the converted storage shed they called the community hall, the walls echoed with tension. Karen stood at the front with her clipboard visibly rattled. She tried to speak about unity, miscommunication, misunderstandings of intent, but the crowd wasn't buying it. I waited until she tried to pivot the blame back to me. That's when I walked to the front, handed the moderator a flash drive, and asked them to play the footage. The projector clicked on. Todd's face filled the screen. Karen's voice off camera was faint but unmistakable. Just open it and fix it. He'll never know. The room fell into complete silence, then laugh, then murmurs, then anger. Within seconds, motion was raised. Remove Karen as president. It passed. Overwhelmingly, Karen stood frozen, lips tight, eyes hollow. She didn't say a word as she gathered her clipboard and left. That evening, Helena, the quiet board member, approached me. She apologized sincerely, said the board would pay for the repairs, asked if I'd consider reopening the valve. I told her yes, but under one condition. We rewrite the agreement permanently. No more assumptions, no more hidden pipes, no more self-appointed monarchs, she agreed. And when I reopened the valve that night, the pressure hissed back to life like a dragon exhaling after a long, bitter sleep. Water flowed again. But so did truth, so did consequence. And the silence that returned wasn't one of control, it was one of respect. Karen's silence wasn't the kind that marks surrender, it was the kind that plots. After the board vote removed her from power, she vanished from the group app, stopped attending meetings, and kept her blinds drawn all day. The neighborhood moved on quickly, too quickly. Within a week, lawns began humming with sprinklers. Again, kids splashed in backyard inflatable pools, and people waved at each other like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Power doesn't let go without claw marks. And Karen had claws. The interim board, now under Helena's calm but cautious leadership, followed through on their promise. They paid for licensed crew to repair the severed pipe properly, reconnected it with insulated fittings, and added low meter per my request, not for control, but for clarity. Transparency was non-negotiable now. I watched from the porch as the team worked, clipboard in hand, making sure every bolt turned and every valve seated. I even brought him cold water. Ironic, considering the context. As I signed off on the final inspection, Helena handed me the drafted agreement. It was clean, simple, acknowledged my ownership, outlined flow rates, set maintenance responsibilities, and included clause that any future adjustments required my written consent with 30 days' notice. I had my lawyer review it. We only made one addition. If access was ever interfered with again, the HOA would immediately forfeit all usage rights pending arbitration, they agreed. But something still itched. I couldn't name it, not then. It sat under the surface like splinter you feel but can't find. I figured time would either reveal it or dull it. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, it arrived in the form of certified envelope delivered to my doorstep by a man who looked equally confused and apologetic. It was lawsuit, filed by Karen Wilbur. The charges: defamation, intentional emotional distress, loss of community standing, malicious manipulation of natural resources. The language was dramatic, the tone self-righteous, and the reasoning flimsy. She claimed I had humiliated her publicly, turned the neighborhood against her, and used my ownership of a lake to enforce psychological warfare. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud reading it on the porch. My wife heard me from the kitchen and came out drying her hands. What is it now? I handed her the letter. She read it in silence, then exhaled. She really can't let go, can she? Apparently not. I called my lawyer immediately. He was more amused than alarmed. This isn't even case, he said. It's tantrum written in Times New Roman. Still, we treated it seriously. We drafted comprehensive response. Attached were all legal ownership documents, water rights, HOA violation reports, surveillance footage from the sabotage attempt, and copy of the county engineer's findings. We listed witnesses, attached the sheriff's statement, and ended it with formal warning. Proceed with litigation. And we countersued for trespassing, property damage, defamation, and attempted sabotage. 2 days later, Karen's lawyer withdrew the complaint. No apology, no explanation. Just a quiet disappearance from the legal battlefield she had hoped to weaponize. I assumed that was the end of it, but assumption was always where people in this neighborhood got in trouble. That weekend, the HOA hosted the town hall aimed at rebuilding trust. I was asked to speak, not as plaintiff or owner or vigilante, just as neighbor. I agreed, though I hesitated. I didn't want victory lap. I wanted closure. The hall was packed, not with hostility, but something deeper, reflection. I told the story. From the cut pipe to the summer bash to the lawsuit. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I simply laid out the facts. I told them I never wanted power, just water. I never wanted fight, just fairness. That I didn't shut off the flow to punish, but to protect. That the real danger wasn't me owning the lake. It was them forgetting who owned their decisions. After I spoke, there was long pause, and someone clapped, slowly, and more. Not thunderous, not performative. Just honest acknowledgement. Afterward, 3 residents came up and apologized. One was a man who had shared Karen's original post without question. Another was mother who had yelled at me during the party meltdown. The third was teenager who admitted he'd believed the rumors. I told them all the same thing. It's not about taking sides. It's about asking better questions. Over the next few weeks, things changed. Small things, but meaningful. The HOA communication style softened. Notices became suggestions. Fines became conversations. Helena introduced open forums before votes. Residents were invited to contribute input, not just compliance. I proposed community water conservation plan, not as a mandate, but a shared goal, passed unanimously. But more than structural change, there was cultural shift. A man who once got fined for his mailbox color was now head of the neighborhood welcome committee. A woman previously written up for overgrown herbs was teaching kids how to grow basil and mint. At weekend garden club, the lake, once invisible, came symbol. People brought trash bags and gloves and cleaned its banks without being asked. They planted native flowers to protect runoff. Someone even suggested building small wooden dock with benches. I offered to help fund it, not because I wanted praise, but because something rare was happening, restoration without resentment. But peace like pressure needs to be managed. One evening, I spotted two teenagers near the valve housing. They weren't tampering, just poking around. Curious, I approached, and they froze like raccoons caught mid-snap. I smiled and waved them over, showed them how the system worked, how the lake fed the pipes, how one misunderstanding nearly turned party into parable. They asked if I really shut off the water just to prove point. I said, no. I shut it off because someone broke the rules. And when people don't respect what they don't understand, consequences usually arrive holding wrench. They laughed and the tension melted, but the truth sat in their eyes. They got it. The lake had become more than water. It was memory, reminder. And Karen, well, the last I heard, she moved to another HOA, 2 counties over, one with stricter rules, fewer questions, and board stacked with people who probably think power lives in paper. Neighbor forwarded me photo. Karen standing at podium during candidates night. Apparently, she tried to run for a seat on the board there. She lost by a landslide. I don't take joy in that. Only symmetry. The final echo of chapter that tried to close itself with pride and instead drowned in its own arrogance. Me? I still walk the lake every evening. I still listen for the pumps. And sometimes I hear laughter from across the water where neighbors now picnic and talk and remember the time things got too dry before they finally got better. And every once in a while I stop at the dock, sit down, and reread the bronze plaque installed at its base. Water is shared gift. Respect the source. Not just message from them, but promise to myself. Summer came with its usual promises. Warm air, longer evenings, kids on bikes carving invisible lines across cul-de-sacs. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just the freshly mended pipe or the silent resignation of Karen Wilbur that changed the rhythm of the neighborhood. It was something deeper, something like exhalation, as if the entire community had spent years holding its breath under the weight of unspoken rules and quiet resentment, and now finally remembered how to breathe. The lake became more than a body of water. It became symbol, point of reference people casually mentioned in conversation as if it had always been there in their minds instead of just in the background. I'm heading past the lake, they'd say, well, let's meet the dock. No one questioned who owned it anymore. They just accepted it. Not with envy, but with something close to respect. I didn't weaponize my ownership. That's what people expected me to do at first. But instead, I leaned into stewardship. I hosted monthly cleanup, brought donuts, let the kids name the raccoon that showed up near the valve station every other evening. They called him Sherman. Don't ask why. It stuck. I started small. Just few families. By the 3rd month, we had over 30 volunteers. Kids pulled bottles out of the reeds. Parents helped repaint the park bench facing the shoreline. A local high school student even asked if she could do her environmental science project on our water ecosystem. I said yes and handed her every file I had. We added a compost bin and a native plant garden. The lake transformed into a living classroom, a neutral ground, a healing place. But I wasn't naive. I knew peace doesn't just stick because people clap and plant flowers. So I worked with my lawyer to formalize additional protections. Revised easement clauses filed with the county, extending beyond mere usage rights. We built in layers, emergency response protocols, infrastructure access boundaries, and a fail-safe notification system for any changes affecting flow. The new HOA board approved it without a single objection. A few called it overkill. I called it permanent insurance against future stupidity. Still, I knew legal armor wasn't enough. Culture had to shift. So I kept telling the story. Not the Karen version, not the drama, but the quiet truth. At school events, at cookouts, in passing, I explained how one misstep, one assumption, one failure to ask question had nearly dried up an entire neighborhood, and how it was all avoidable if someone had just paused and thought, what if I'm wrong? That question became quiet motto in our neighborhood. You'd hear it at board meetings. You'd see it scribbled in the margins of HOA proposal drafts. What if I'm wrong? It wasn't weakness. It was awareness, accountability. One afternoon, new family moved in at the edge of the development near the back trail. They were young, idealistic. full of Pinterest-inspired landscaping dreams. Their welcome letter included line about being excited to meet the lake guy. That was me, apparently. I laughed when they said it, but the term stuck. Not Lord, not owner, just lake guy, better than water tire. I showed them around, told them what the HOA had been and what it was trying to become. They listened. Asked good questions. That's when I realized something had taken root here. Not just better leadership, but better neighbors. Not perfect, but less afraid to speak. One evening, while adjusting the sensor readings on the flow monitor near the intake line, I heard laughter behind me. Two kids, teenagers I didn't recognize, were daring each other to touch the pipe as if it were radioactive. I waved them over. They froze. I didn't scold. I explained, showed them the system, the valves, the filtration. They asked about the summer party, the one that went dry. I told them the story, unfiltered. Did you shut it off to get revenge? One asked. I smiled and said no. I shut it off because someone decided to rule instead of lead. And when that happens, sometimes you don't fight. Sometimes you just remind them where the water comes from. One of them nodded slowly. Makes sense. And they ran off, laughing the way kids do when something serious brushes up against their world before they're ready to fully hold it. But I think they got it at least little. News of our lake's journey didn't stay local for long. I received an invitation, emailed, formal, complete with conference logo and itinerary. The Regional HOA Leadership Council wanted me to speak at their upcoming summit on private infrastructure and conflict resolution. At first, I laughed, me thinking to a room full of people who probably looked like Karen in different pantsuits. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw the value. If I didn't go, someone else might tell a different version of the story, one where I was the villain with shove-off valve and grudge. So I said yes, I prepared, not with slides or statistics, but with the story, just the story. No theatrics, no edits. I stood in a crowded conference room full of HOA board members, attorneys, urban planners, and overwhelmed new homeowners wondering what kind of gated hellscape they'd bought into. I told them everything, from the cut pipe to the viral meltdown, from the sabotage to the restoration, from the silence to the community that learned to speak. And I ended it with simple truth. I didn't shut off the water because I was angry. I shut it off because someone crossed line they didn't even bother to understand. And when you forget the source of what sustains you, you don't just risk your water, you risk everything it touches. They clapped, some awkwardly, some sincerely. Few asked to speak with me after. One woman cried, said her HOA president was starting to act like Karen, asked what she should do. I said, ask better questions, read everything, and make sure no one forgets the difference between authority and responsibility. I flew home that night. The stars blinked across the wing. Beneath them, thousands of lakes, thousands of neighborhoods, thousands of invisible valves waiting to be turned. When I pulled into the neighborhood just before midnight, I found a small sign posted at the entrance to the lake trail. It was wooden, hand-painted, slightly crooked, the kind only a kid could make and be proud of. It read, "Welcome to Peace Lake. Take only what you need. Give back what you can." I stood there longer than I expected, rereading it like it was scripture. No signature, no author, just message. But it said everything. It wasn't mine, not really, but it told our story. And more importantly, it wrote the first line of what would come next. Not about one man or one valve, but about what happens when a community remembers how to listen to each other before someone is forced to make them hear.